So welcome to this exploration in large systems complex change, another webinar here today, looking in particular at a methodology of how to do scenario development. And we're very pleased to be able to have Christel Scholten, who's with ReosPartners in Brazil, explain to us the approach that she's applied in Brazil, dealing with the issue of education. Christel, welcome.
Thank you, Steve.
Would you like to just introduce yourself as how you got into this particular project?
Sure. So I'm Christel, I'm Canadian, but I've been living in Brazil for the last 12 years, and I'm part of ReosPartners in Brazil, so one of the managing director for ReosPartners in Brazil. And I got into this project basically because through the work that we've been doing in large-scale system change in Brazil, we kept seeing that a big issue that needed to be addressed in Brazil was the issue of education. So and what we did with Rios is a few years ago is we set up an institute to be able to convene large projects, so to be able to receive funding and also convene partners from different parts of systems rather than having more of a client service provider relationship. And so we really sort of started this project mapping out the stakeholders in the system and seeing if there would be a need to be able to do a scenarios project and really explore the issue and help sort of unstick some parts of the system.
Thank you. So you're going to take us through some understanding about the approach you applied. We're going to be light on the actual content of what happened in the education system is because it's the methodology and the experience of its application that we actually want to focus on. So just as an explanation.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So an explanation of the methodology, is that what you're
Yeah, I would just start the, move to the next slide if you want to introduce us to what you did in your approach.
Okay, so I'll just start actually with a little bit of it's a slide on the theory of change that Rios works with in a general sense, and then I'll focus much more on the education, but just to give a bit of a context in terms of how we look at change in complex social challenges that we're facing in different parts of the world. So there's three, we say that there's sort of three starting points or conditions that a diverse coalition of leading actors see the status quo as unacceptable or unsustainable. So that's one of the requirements or conditions that's required that we see is needed. A second one is that the situation can't be transformed immediately or directly by any single party. So it is actually a problem that's of the system and it requires many different actors to work together. And the third condition is these actors want to join with others to act collectively to address this challenge. And so what we see is needed in this is a whole system team. So we talk about it being a microcosm of the system so that we get the diverse perspectives from that system. Experienced guides, which in this case would be a team from Rios that has a number of different capacities to be able to guide people through the process. Also a generative process. So this is a process that's systemic, collaborative, and creative. And we use methodologies that engage the entire self. So heads, heart, the head, the heart, and the hands. And it's also a process that relies very much on emergence and experimentation. Another aspect that's needed is resources. So we need to have the specific resources in terms of people, the political, social, human, symbolic, and financial to be able to run a project or program of this scale, and the resources are adequate for the scale of the challenge. And also a very strong container, so creating a very secure and safe space for people to be able to feel comfortable in sharing and exploring together. And a few of the things that are produced are new relationships and teams, because these are actors from diverse parts of the system. So many times they haven't been together in the same room before. So this does create new relationships and teams, new understandings and logics. and also new capacities and approaches, new commitments and strategies, and new experiments and programs. So these are some of the shorter term outcomes that come out. And if you look at some of the longer term actions and things that come out, are new languages and narratives, specifically in the case of scenarios, new alliances and movements, in some cases, new policies and rules, also possibly new institutions and ecologies, and yeah, essentially those are the main things that could come out from a process like this.
Can you give us some sense of the range of timeframes when you say short term and longer term?
Yeah, in terms of the shorter terms, you see some of these things emerging throughout the process. So with the scenarios process, and the one that we went through was a year and a half. And so through the workshops and the processes, we saw many new relationships and teams forming, new relationships forming. But if you look at some immediately after, with the construction of the scenarios, we see new languages and narratives starting to form, new alliances and movements. And some of the longer term ones could be 6 months, a year, or a few years down the road, where you'd see new policies, rules, institutions, ecologies emerging. But many of the shorter term things would happen along the process. The participants actually having new capacities and approaches to looking at the situation, new commitments and strategies would be happening quite soon, during or quite soon after.
And when you've said a diverse coalition of leading actors, is that, do they generally come to you with that, or is your situation analysis something that you put them together?
Yeah, in many cases, we form sort of a convening alliance, which would be a number of the key organizations that would create credibility for that system, that would be credible in that system. And then from that, we create a governance process. And many times they actually are the ones who define who are these stakeholders in the system that need to be brought together. So often we will be consulting with them to map the system and map who should be part of this process.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
So I can go to the next slide, which talks a little bit just about the scenarios process. This is a well-known methodology used mainly in companies. And 20 years ago, one of the first experiences of using this was done in South Africa by Adam Kahane. He was part of the scenario planning team at Shell in London and was invited to go to South Africa with the transition to democracy from the apartheid system. And he was invited to facilitate a multi-sector, multi-stakeholder group of actors who was interested in looking at the future of South Africa. And this was the first time he was placed in a situation where it was a multi-stakeholder group. And also one of the differentiators from his experience in Shell was that this was a group of actors who wanted to influence the system. So that was the first time that he had sort of adapted the methodology to a social system, social political system. And from that experience brought it to many others, other countries, other issues around the world, with groups of actors who wanted to actually influence the system. So we have used that in Brazil in a number of situations, and we felt that it would be very useful to use the scenarios approach for the education system, because one of the things that differentiates a few of the approaches that we use with scenarios, it's really when the system is not ready to necessarily act together, because they're in such a polarized situation. But they are willing to come together to think together about the future. So what we say at the beginning of a scenarios process is that there's no commitment to action. The only action that is really required is to sit together and think together about possible futures. So that gives a much more secure and safe space for many of these actors that may be in conflict with each other, ideologically, politically, and to be able to just sit together and think together about possible futures. And there's no commitment to real action after that, just the commitment to think together. So that's why we felt that the scenarios process would be useful in this situation, because that was the situation that we were encountering with the education system a year and a half ago when we started this process.
So when you talk to the people you're bringing together, what is the time commitment? Is it over, and it's over the year and a half period, I presume, that you referred to earlier?
Yeah, yeah, it depends for every scenarios process, but for this one, it was a commitment of a year. So we started with the group, with the convening alliance, it's about a year and a half because they're part of more of the decision making before. But with the actual participants, which in this case of the education scenarios was 40 participants, they participated in an hour and a half interview, face-to-face interview, which has specific questions thinking about the future, the present, the past. And then also they participated in 3 workshops over the period of 6 months. And then after the workshops were finished, they participated in an iterative process of writing together. So they wrote together the scenarios report, so the narratives of the 4 scenarios that came out. So that was a very collective and participatory approach, and then participated in the launch and sort of a debriefing of the whole process, which happened in August this year.
And is there any expectation about their organizations that they're associated with in terms of promoting the scenarios or getting people engaged in them?
Yeah, so in terms of when we say not committing to action, the action would be constructing the scenarios together, thinking together, and also disseminating. So we selected these organizations that are the representatives of these organizations because of the people themselves, but then also because of the networks and the organizations that they represent. So the idea is that now that it's launched, it's in the public domain, that they would take these into their organizations, into the networks, and really contribute to the public debate on education. So they're in that phase right now with materials, videos, presentations that they can then take into their organizations at different levels. So we want to be targeting different levels of government, teachers, schools, the wider system, but also focusing very much on the decision makers as well.
But the people who actually are involved in the scenario development is the 40 people that you referred to then?
Yeah. So those are that's the main group that we're working with. And those are the people that we're really, developing to be able to, they already have leadership capacities in their organizations, but then it's just helping them and supporting them to disseminate these scenarios and run workshops or bring these scenarios into different conferences or events or strategic meetings so that it can actually help people take better decisions about the future, because they're looking at with these scenarios, we set them for 2032, so it's giving them a longer view into the future of what are possible futures that this group came up with and thought was relevant for the Brazilian education system.
So when they take this into discussion, is the thought that they go in with into the discussion with an open mind about what scenario their particular constituency might prefer, or do they go with sort of saying this is the one that we think is best?
Yeah, so there's 2 moments. While they're developing the scenarios, it's very important that they don't put their personal desires and wishes into the scenarios, but really have a look at what are the main concerns that the group is seeing with education. What are the strongest forces that are at play with the education system? What are the main certainties, the uncertainties that they see for 2032 in this case? And what are the scenarios, or what are the stories that would be the most relevant? We have 4 criteria that we really work with when we're talking about scenarios. So whether they are relevant to the challenges at hand, challenging enough so that they challenge our status quo, challenge our thinking, our mental models, that they are actually plausible. So it is feasible. You can see that these can happen in the future. It's not just a a wish or a dream, or something that's too far out to be able to be considered, but also on the limit of the plausibility. So it's not too status quo, too much of more of the same, and also that they're clear. So when we work with scenarios, we want to be working with a set of between 2 and 4 scenarios, so that it's not a large number of scenarios that would be difficult to remember. So those are some of the criteria. And what we always say when we're working with the group is that the scenarios are not stories about what will happen, so it's not a forecast. And also they're not recommendations, stories about what should happen. So there's this moment of constructing the scenarios. It's really important that they put their perspectives in, but not their desires and their wishes. So that kind of closes that phase of, the production of construction of the scenarios. And then we enter a phase of dissemination where they can obviously take, which scenario that they prefer. And that comes into more of the transformative aspect is, how do I want to influence the future towards the scenario that I may have more of a tendency towards. So that's more of the proactive piece, where they can be more agents of change towards a certain scenario. But what the group itself in this case is really, they were very committed to making sure that they were creating a set of scenarios that represented the possible futures that they saw, that could be desires of some. It may not be a desire of all. So because it is such a polarized group, some obviously would have tendencies to one scenario, others to another. But when they're presenting the scenarios, they want to present it in a balanced way. And also, in this case, 2 of the scenarios they presented as alerts, as potential risks to the education system. But when they're showing the scenarios, when they're sharing them, they want to present them more in a balanced view, that they see that these are 4 perspectives that could happen. And if they're working within, so this is more when it's to a general public and a wider audience, but if they're working within their own organizations or their own networks, they obviously will put their opinion in terms of which direction that they're trying to take the organization or the education system, how they're trying to influence and contribute to that.
Thank you.
So, Steve, I could go into a little bit about the content of the.
Yeah,
I'm not sure how
it would be
relevant that
good
is to the
to
group, but yeah.
get just a feeling for
Yeah.
what type of product you come up with.
Sure. So I'll just give a little bit of the context. So just for those of you outside of Brazil who don't understand or don't have contact with the education system in Brazil, it's in quite a critical situation. If you look at the international rankings for the PISA rankings, which is an international ranking for education, Brazil comes out of 65 countries, it comes out 55 and 57 in the rankings for languages, sciences, math. So if you look at the whole situation, it's quite a critical situation. In 1988, with the Constitution of Brazil, that was the first time that education became a real right, a constitutional right. So it is quite recent still if you look at the history. And because of the situation of inequality in Brazil, it's also a very unequal system. So it's a good quality education for the rich, for the elite, and a poor quality system for the masses and for the poor. And for those who are in a more vulnerable situation, like indigenous peoples, Black populations, and economic poor, and also those from the rural areas. So there's a very unequal aspect to the education system. And one of the big challenges, especially coming from Canada, where it's a smaller population, most of the education is public. If you look here in Brazil, it's a huge problem of scale as well. There's 50 million students in the basic education system. So that's from ages 4 to 17. There are 200,000 schools and 2 million teachers. So it's just to give you a sense of the scale, if you're coming from a smaller country. So it's also, if you look at the actual situation in the country, where it is a very unequal society, and the scale of the challenge. It's not an easy issue to be working on. So that's a bit of just the context.
And can you,
And mhm.
what what type of information or inputs do you have about setting the context with the participants, or knowledge about what the state is? Because they
Yeah.
must have quite diverse perspectives about both what they think about the state of it and where their emphasis is about.
Yeah. So what we did do, so many come from the system, so they know, the key documents. They and also in Brazil, leading up to this process, they had been there's what they have in Brazil is a national education plan, and that is a construction that's done with civil society. So it's government led, but with participation of civil society. And that plan was supposed to be implemented or sanctioned in 2011. And it took 3 years to go through Congress and through the whole political system. And so it actually only got sanctioned and approved in 2014. So there was 3 years of a lot of dispute, to get different things on the agenda on this plan. So when we encountered the system, or the people in the system, they were very much just coming out of that process, a very difficult process for many, but they were all, very in touch with all the data, the statistics. So it was a field that was already very much, very educated in terms of the different things that were going on. But we did also have a demographic study conducted, just to give a little bit of a, I guess, the common background for the education system. But most of the people in the system already knew that information. This was more of a study that was done also for the wider public when we published the report, to give the wider public a better understanding of the state of the education system in Brazil. And also one of the inputs for the first workshop was a synthesis of the interviews that were conducted with 71 of the actors. So only 40 participated in the workshops, but 71 actors were interviewed. So that was part of the context setting as well.
Did they perceive it more as scenarios about how to implement the plan then?
One of the scenarios, that was a big input to the scenarios was the national plan. So this would be sort of a guidance for all of the scenarios, and we see that reference in the narrative, in the report as well, very much. So that was kind of the input for it, but it wasn't only, you didn't need to stick to just the implementation of that. If you look at one of the scenarios is very much following the national plan as it's with the 20 goals that are in the plan, and just showing how that actually happens, so the actual full implementation of that plan, with also a few variations to that. So one of the scenarios is very much the implementation of the plan, but the other scenarios is with that as a base, what also can happen.
And can you give us a bit more idea about what actually happens in the meetings that you've organized for discussion, like how you've organized the agenda and carry on the discussion, what some of your design thoughts are?
Yeah. So the first workshop is very much, the team getting to know each other. So we call it the scenarios team, the group of 40. So, a lot of exercise just to get people understanding the perspectives of the others. So we do, paired walks, so they can connect with different people. Especially we ask people to connect to people that they don't know, that they may also think that their opinions are quite opposite from their own. We involve them in interviewing each other. So we try to just break that a little bit in getting them, into more of a dialogue mode rather than a debating or a dispute mode. And a lot of interactive exercises. So obviously starting with a check-in, why are you here? What are you bringing with you? But also, mapping the forces, mapping the concerns, identifying what are the certainties, the uncertainties, defining the timeline, what is I guess the timeline for the scenario. So all of that is part of the first workshop, and very interactive, working at tables, identifying what are the key forces, prioritizing, sharings. So that was really in the first workshop. In the second workshop, We did, so coming together again, you know, what are we seeing? But then also we did a bit of a nature retreat. So they had a bit of time in nature just to really connect to who they are in the system, and what stories that they felt would be relevant and needed for the education system. So we do a little bit of more of an introspective approach, and then coming out of that, a big, you know, brainstorming individually. What stories do they see are emerging that they think would be relevant and useful? And then in that second workshop, we actually had about 50 flip charts with 50 different possible scenarios, and then just a more creative process of and self-organizing process of identifying what are the key scenarios, and they came up with 4 scenarios in that workshop. And then the last workshop was really working on the actual narratives. So, you know, sitting at computers, writing up the scenarios, getting feedback, sharing. One of the key activities we did actually in the second workshop was a table that identified what were the differentiators between the 4 scenarios. So they selected 6 criteria that they thought were the main differentiators between the scenarios, which I can just share quickly now.
That's great, because I was just going to ask them what they were.
Yeah, yeah. So the differentiators in this case for the education were diversities and inequalities, because inequality is, those 2 issues are very you know, very strong in Brazil. So when we're talking about inequalities, it's income inequality, gender, color, whether you're rural or urban, whether you're studying in the center of the city or on the periphery. So those would be the inequalities in the system, and the diversities.
So when you say a differentiator, you mean whether they address these issues. Is that?
So they will, each of the scenarios will address these issues, but it will play out in a different way. So what happens in each scenario will be different. So what happens with inequalities in one scenario will be different from another one. What happens in, so the first one is diversities and inequalities. The second one is participation and social control. So how involved is society in and the different actors in the education system, and how much they control. So what ways do they have this participation and control of the education system, sort of the monitoring, the accountability aspect, and the role of the state. So how involved is the state in the education system? And in one scenario, you know, in a few scenarios, there's more of a presence of the state. In others, it's more of a delegation to other parties. What is the educational paradigm? So in terms of if it's a more traditional type of education, if it's a more an educational system that is looking at the teacher not as the sole proprietor of the information and the student, you know, the receiver of the information, but much more of a mediator role, exploring different, really looking at what happens in terms of the educational paradigm in each of the scenarios. The management model is more of, you know, how education is managed, who is involved, and then also the public-private balance. So how much of the system is public and how much is private. And so for those were the 6 differentiators that this group identified.
So I'm just reflecting that one of the liberating qualities of the scenarios approach is that it doesn't have to deal with the issue of consensus or agreement, right? It allows people to gravitate to what they feel comfortable with and still recognize others. So it creates this understanding of diverse perspectives as well, and creates it as a holding space for it.
Yeah, yeah. So the only consensus that is needed is whether these 4 scenarios, if they agree that these 4 scenarios are plausible, you know, that they actually can happen in Brazil. So that's the consensus. But within that, you know, each scenario, and obviously each group, you know, gives feedback, improves each of the different scenarios. We made sure throughout the whole process that not that people that were working on especially in the second and third workshops, when the 4 scenarios actually emerged, that not the same people were working on the same scenarios the whole time. So we always we're changing the groups to make sure that the different perspectives work incorporated into these 4 scenarios. So it's not the people that want to work for more of a innovation in the education system are only working together without any perspectives of the others, but that those challenges are incorporated into each scenario. So what we really tried to do as well is make sure that there was no, that it's not a heaven and hell type of scenarios where you've got one scenario that's the perfect scenario and the other scenario, which is the worst scenario. So in each of the scenarios, you'll see challenges. You won't see any one that is a perfect scenario or because each one will have its different challenges. And so that was the role of the group, was looking at each of the scenarios and looking at what are the opportunities and what are the challenges or the issues in each of the different scenarios.
So it strikes me that there must be a lot of work still by the team in between these meetings to be able to put the words together in ways and the scenarios together.
Yeah, so we have we hire scenario, or part of the team, the Rios team, is a scenarios writer. So that person is involved in each of the workshops and then does an iteration between the workshops as well, and sends out a copy before the next workshop so people can get an idea of what's coming up and where they want to give feedback and how. And then after the 3rd workshop, there was quite a gap between the next time that they were together and the production of all the materials. Was a lot of iteration using Google Docs, for example, and track changes. So a lot of iteration with the reports so that we can get the voices and make sure that it is a really collective, collaborative effort by the group.
Thank you. So I interrupted your description. You were starting to outline the actual content. You were saying that one followed more or less the plan of the legislature.
Yeah. So so there's the 4 scenarios, and what we did also to make it more memorable, more clear, especially in this phase of dissemination, was we put metaphors, and the metaphors that they came up with for these scenarios were 4 types of birds that you could find in Brazil. And it also represents each scenario. The actual bird has characteristics that are represented in each of the different scenarios. So the first scenario, as part of this set of 4, is the canary. And the characteristic of the canary is that it's very collective, works together, and is very territorial as well. So this was representing a scenario that is for all of Brazil, where the state and civil society are working together to create a quality education for all in Brazil. This is the scenario that follows much more the plan, the goals. So you'll see the different things that are stated in these goals are present in the narrative report in terms of the different aspects that are covered. Training of teachers, the financing aspect, the national curriculum. So many of those things you will see in this report, or in this scenario. This one has participation of civil society, participating through formal approaches like councils, school councils, large conferences, government-led conferences. But it is also a more traditional type of education. So the actual pedagogy doesn't change, but it is a quality education for all. But it's more traditional. So that's a bit of the challenge in this scenario, is that it's much more of a traditional type of education. Mm-hmm. The second scenario is the hummingbird, and that's based on a lot of the social, environmental, technological changes that are happening in the world, new methodologies, new approaches, new ideas. So a lot of the innovations are in this scenario. Not saying that there's not innovation in the other scenarios, but more of the innovation is very much concentrated in this, where there's different models of education happening, where in Brazil there's a couple of really good examples of, it's called, if you do the translation, it's city schools, so that the school is really part of the larger environment, the city or the community, and that the learning doesn't only happen in the school system, but happens in museums, in parks, working with technology. So it's a much more open type of education where the role of the teacher is more of a mediator role rather than the person that's passing the knowledge on. So it's a but the challenge with this scenario is much more of scale, that it's very difficult to bring that type of approach to scale. So that's just a bit of a summary of that one. Aspects like sustainability, environmental responsibility are very present in this scenario. And there's also public-private partnership, but it's a public-private partnership that is benefiting the public sector. The third scenario is the falcon, or the hawk, actually. And that is a scenario more of privatization, where all sorts of aspects of privatization. So it's where the role of the state is diminished. They are no longer really the executors. They're really delegating that responsibility to the private sector and to other players. And it's a much more standard type of education. It is for all, but it is also an education that's more focused on the workforce, developing the workforce and a qualified workforce, but not necessarily looking at wider aspects of the human being in that sense. And so the different types of privatization could be the privatization of the management of a school, of a public school. It could be through scholarships that are given to it's public money given to private institutions, and there's a number of different forms for that in Brazil. The families are, there's very little participation in the actual school system. It's very much treated as a client service relationship. So that's really this scenario. And the last scenario, I don't know if that bird exists outside of Brazil, but it's called Chico Chico. But it has a characteristic of a special characteristic that it jumps in the same spot a number of times to get its food. So this is really the scenario of more of the same, that things don't really change, that there's still the same disputes are continuing here, increasing violence, disinterest by the youth, especially in the high school age or the junior middle school, where many are leaving the schools because they don't find it interesting. So it's quite in a sense, it's got a lot of the negative aspects, but it also represents a lot of what's happening today in the education system. It's got a lot of religious conservatism, so a lot of the advances that Brazil has made in terms of rights, gender inequality, sexual representation or identity, all of those rights are kind of challenged in this situation or in this scenario. So that's just to give a bit of an overview of the four.
It strikes me that it's quite an art to be able to create the scenario, describe it in a sense of coherence of internal logic. That's, I guess that's really the art of the scenario writer who you referred to, eh?
Yeah. And also the team, like the Rios team was very, very involved. So the writer doesn't write on his own. I was leading this project and I was with him most of the time, just receiving the feedback from the group, trying to incorporate that feedback. Also, we aren't experts in the system, so we had someone else who was kind of just looking at the wording, looking at some of the terminology that we were using to make sure that it was aligned with the actual terminology that's used in the education system, and making sure that it's coherent and consistent. But it did take a number of months to go through that process and getting the feedback from the people. So it's an art of the writer is fundamental in this case, but also he had the support of others to be able to really carve and create the narrative.
What do you think the role is? I'm just wondering how we develop imagination about how it can be different. And I'm wondering what the role is of, say, international comparisons. You can see, well, another country it's like this. And so that shows how Brazil has evolved differently, or the role of looking internally in Brazil and seeing variation internally in the country as the basis of the scenarios.
Yeah, I think the international comparison is interesting, and it did come in terms of, you know, bringing in different examples of what other countries are doing, especially the countries that are at the top of the PISA. You know, there's a sort of the reference countries. So there's a lot of that, and many of the people that participated are very aware of a number of the trends that are happening internationally. And I think also it's interesting, you know, even though these were built for, created for Brazil, there's many aspects here that you could see in especially the emerging markets, Latin American countries, countries maybe in Asia, Africa, where there will be a lot of similar issues. Obviously, the contexts are completely different, but many of the issues that you're dealing with, especially in a developing country where you've got, you know, a lot of the private and the public, you know, kind of that type of education, you could see a lot of that. In terms of looking internally to Brazil, I think one of the things that we could have maybe done differently is to really look at what we did look at it a little bit, but didn't push it that much, was really looking at what country does Brazil want to become, and therefore what kind of education would be needed for that. It was there, it was present, but it wasn't necessarily looking at, you know, the larger context of, you know, climate change was mentioned. It is, you know, when they talked about the certainties in 2032, they said for sure climate change would still be there. So it was part of the context, but it wasn't woven in that much. So I think, you know, what could have been useful is to look at this larger, wider context of, you know, a world with climate change, with youth that are, you know, have completely different needs today than they did, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago. You know, that was present, but probably could have been brought in a little bit more in terms of maybe a visioning exercise. I'm not sure if a visioning exercise, because that takes it away from what the exercise of scenarios are, but some sort of look at what kind of Brazil do you want, and then therefore looking at today and the forces today, what kind of education do you see that is happening or could happen? Yeah. So I think those pieces could have been. And I think another piece we could have done differently as well is bringing more people from outside of the education system to really challenge people who are always, you know, in the day-to-day working in the system. We didn't, you know, neuroscientists, for example, or you know, artists, you know, radical, you know, people from the fringes a little bit in terms of, you know, challenging more what people from within the system, you know, working on the system for 20, 30 years, you know, could have given them a little bit of different perspective. So I think those are a few of the different things that we could have done. But you always learn from every project. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
I just see the comment from Jiran. Could you share with us more on how it supported the coalition building process? How did diverse interests and viewpoints come together as a result of the process?
Yeah, I think that was probably, if you look at some of the results, that was probably the top result. If you look at the overall process in terms of, obviously you have the report, you have these scenarios out in the public, but if you look at the transformation within the group, it was quite remarkable. So them coming in this dispute relationship from the, you know, negotiations around the national plan, and how they, you know, even people from complete opposite polar ends of the system were, you know, talking to each other, understanding the perspective. And when we had the meeting on the 20th of August after the launch, we had a public launch where we invited a number of, you know, the people who participated, but also all the people who participated and were interviewed, but also key actors, other actors from the system. One of the things that one of the people said, you know, she was part of the convening alliance, and she said that when we first spoke, so this was in September, October of 2013, before the project started, and we were just trying to get people on board. She said, this is an impossible and improbable thing. You will never get these people together in the same room. And then when she spoke, at the launch, she was just saying, she repeated that, and she said, this has been an amazing process that, we are together, this team of 40, and they are calling themselves a team, a scenarios team of 40. They're very proud of what they were able to produce together. And there's a lot, especially it was really remarkable when they came together again for the second workshop, just the hugs, the embraces, the expressions on their faces, to be able to see each other and to, just the excitedness to be together again was quite amazing, because that was quite different from the entrance of the first workshop. So in terms of actual coalitions, a few new alliances it's still quite recent, a few possible connections. I'm not sure we could say coalitions yet, but connections have definitely been made. Still, they're out, in terms of fighting for what they believe in and which scenario they think should happen. But, there's much more of an understanding and respect for the other, I think, for sure. In terms of coalitions, maybe around groups that want a similar scenario, not necessarily coalitions among especially the groups that wanted, that are more, they agree on that they want to have a quality education for all and guarantee the right for quality education for all. That's what they really agree on, but the ways that they get there would be different. So, but I think just a lot of the relationships that were built is one of the key results of the process.
You had mentioned that the planning process for the government legislation had preceded this.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the preferable option would be that the legislation would follow this process. Would you say that too? It was just not what you were dealt with?
Yeah, I guess that was the situation that we were faced with. But it is such a complex process in Brazil. I think maybe everywhere, but and it was taking 3 years, and it's a very formal process with not a lot of real dialogue. So it could have been interesting. I'm not sure how much it would have influenced the actual legislation process. We could look at, from here down the road, the next plan will be set in 10 years. But we could see if this influences it in terms of some of these coalitions or relationships that have been built. And it would be nice. But what we can see now is in terms of the implementation of the plan, this can be can be very informative in terms of the implementation. So when they're talking about implementation of a national curriculum, what kind of curriculum, then these scenarios can help inform, the possibilities. So I think, I'm not sure how much it would have, if it would have happened, this legislation, if it would have happened right after, if it would have influenced, because I think you would have needed much more time to be able to do that. But I think for sure it will be able to influence, the implementation of the plan. Yeah.
One of the critiques I saw of Adam's work in South Africa was that it was very elite focused. And that it was basically a very traditional elite that was getting together from tops of these organizations that was determining the future, and there wasn't enough engagement, which of course brings up the role of scenario development, whether it can somehow be broadened. Of course, you're going through this process now of consultation. And how scenario development fits within the range of strategies that's possible, such as the visioning process you described at Center of Public Consultations.
I think the situation with South Africa was he was invited to a group that had already been formed. So that was his first, time facilitating a process that was a multi-stakeholder group. So, but I think what we've learned from processes like that is that it's really important for us to be able to be part of the convening process and identifying. And for us, we have quite strong criteria in terms of who should be in the room, and making sure that the different perspectives and the different, just types of engagement are included. So in this process, we had students from public schools and not from, you know, the best public schools. We had people representing all types of the diversities involved in it. We had people from the different levels of government. So if you look at some of the organizations, yes, they were the leaders of the organizations involved. But if you look at the more wider open public that we invited into the process, that was very diverse and not elitist. Yeah. So I think it's that's one of the crucial steps. And if you get that wrong, the convening piece, like who are the actors in the room, you'll see that has implications in the scenarios after. So that's and for us, that we invited a few people that didn't accept the invitation. They were too, I guess, confrontational with the rest of the group. They just didn't want to step into, didn't know what the process would be like, and didn't want to step into that. So there's a few of the actors that we didn't actually get in the room. We tried, we did what we could to get them in, but in the end, they decided not to. So that could have had, you know, some implications in terms of how strong or how well accepted. But we had a very, very good and diverse group. So there's just a few of the actors that we really wanted that didn't come.
And could you make more a comment about how scenario development, when you would use it as opposed to a visioning process or as opposed to a public consultation process? Is there anything in particular that comes to mind about how to think about scenario development in the array of options there are for addressing complex change challenges?
Yeah, I think consultations are important in many forums to make sure that all the voices are heard, and then, you know, that's fed back, and that, you know, a process can happen from there. A visioning process is quite different. That's really, you know, where do we want to go, and if you have actors who are, you know, on polar opposites, quite difficult to create maybe a unified vision, you know, from a system that's that polarized. So I think a visioning exercise is, it's very useful. Maybe that can come after a scenarios process, or I think you'd have to look at each situation and see which, you know, I don't think scenarios is for every situation at all. You know, I think you need to read the situation. If the group is ready for action, I think a totally different approach would be valid, and you wouldn't need to go through a scenarios process. So I think in the situations where it's very polarized, where it's a very diverse group, where they're not ready to act together, I think it can be useful. You know, scenarios can be useful because one of the things that it does help, it can prepare the field for them to be able to act together. So even though we're creating scenarios, another outcome or another objective is to really bring this group more closely together so that they can then possibly act together a step before something else happens.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, but I definitely don't think, you know, scenarios are the solution for everything and for every situation. I think you need to really read each situation and see what's most relevant at that moment.
Thanks so much. Joanne, feel free to add any questions. Just in closing here, do you have any final reflections upon the process? I appreciated that you commented on some things that you might do differently, have done differently. Maybe it would be a comment on the process moving forward, what your role is in it.
Yeah, I think for this situation, most times when we're in a role of facilitation, we want to really help influence the system, influence policy, influence rules, influence action after. What was very clear to us, which was made quite clear to us from this convening alliance, was that this exercise in itself, they did not want to have any role using this exercise to influence the future. They contribute to the public debate. And for us, that was very difficult to take because we want to influence change. And obviously we think that this has an impact in the system, but the way that this project happened and the conditions, sort of that were placed in terms of this agreement that it was a contribution to the public debate and not to influence policy, because they were strongly feeling that there are other places for that in the system, formal places for that, the government role, the public consultation role that, that already has formal processes in place, that they felt that this was strongly just for the contribution to the public debate. So for us, going forward, we'd like to see be able to be of service in terms of helping, groups that want to maybe implement one of the scenarios or implement aspects. If you look at some of the big challenges or issues, which is the training of teachers, the national curriculum, Indigenous education, rural education. There's ways that we can also support implementation or getting groups together to find solutions together. So this is kind of a separate moment. We have to say we've closed the scenarios process, and now we can enter into the phase of the dissemination and the more the convening action together. But we're not sure yet if there's appetite for that convening action piece yet. I think there's a lot of appetite right now for sharing the scenarios, disseminating them, bringing them into different places, to help decision makers make better decisions. And we're testing that out right now in terms of the convening for action. So we'll have, so that's, for us, that was a big, quite a different type of project, because most times we enter with actors that want to use this to influence the future. Very strongly influence the future, but in this case it was very much to contribute to the public debate.
Thanks so much. Joanne has one final question. Any differences in your mind between hosting a scenario process for national or regional versus global, or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what you need to do is just understand what is needed in that situation. We, some of the team was saying, why don't we just, start at a regional level first? And we just said, let's go for a national process, because it is a huge national issue, and that can help the regional issues. So I think for us in this case, we said we needed this one to be national, but there's many that can happen on a more local, regional scale. In terms of a global issue, there's a number of issues that can be addressed on a global scale, but then, the specificity of it becomes less, the higher up you go in terms of in the system. But if you take a global issue, you could do possibly, climate change, but then you'd have to understand, who are the key actors that need to be in that discussion at that level? Who are the ones that could be really influencing, thinking and decision making at that level? So I think you just need to look at the scale of the challenge and, what is most useful at that moment. In 2013, Rios did a process, Latin American or the Americas process for scenarios for the future of the situation of the drugs problem in the Americas. So that was more of a regional approach. And then there's been many that were done at a local level, a country level, or part of a regional level as well. So memes, in terms of, these new, these 4 birds, which could become a common language in Brazil because what we saw, this one thing I didn't mention, but so after the launch, or even during the process, people would be going to different conferences, events, and they would come back and say, oh, this conference was completely the hummingbird one, or this one was completely the hawk. So it's just, kind of a meme in terms of, a new language that kind of, starts to circulate when we're talking about education.
Okay. Individual development.
I think very much so, in terms of, because it was, many of these people had never dialogued before, so they just didn't know how. And so it's like teaching them, just through the processes, helping them work in dialogue, work together collaboratively. Many people, there was one person, academic, she said, this was the first time I've been in a process like this before. It was one of the best processes I've been in, in terms of dialogue and being able to work together with different people. So I think at the individual level, there's definitely technologically, I don't think.
Yeah, I didn't
Yeah,
perceive much there either.
yeah, no.
So if you were to rate these different change spheres,
Mhm.
what would you say, how would you rate them on a scale of 1 to 10 in importance for the individual? It sounds like it would be near a 10.
Yeah, quite high. Yeah,
Yeah. And
8.
then
Yeah.
and then the social, political, economic structures.
Um, in terms of what we impacted, I think, intent, social for sure. Um, the political, some in terms of political relationships between people. Economic, I'm not so sure. We would have been,
We're
yeah,
thinking about the system here, really,
yeah,
the organizational relationships and the power relationships about how things are done.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think trying to, but I don't think a scenarios process has the impact, to really influence significantly.
Hmm.
Um, it changes relationships, which then can change, people in the systems, and how they relate to others, and how they relate to the structures and the systems. Yeah.
So it sounds relatively low then.
Yeah, I think the intent would be, I think over the longer term, it could be something, but if you look at the short term impact, I'm not so
Uh-huh.
sure how much. Yeah.
Okay, and the memes, values, beliefs on a 0 to 10 scale, uh, probably relatively high, eh?
Yeah. But
Hmm.
maybe not as high as on the individual. Well, yeah, it's kind
Okay,
of
that's very
yeah.
interesting because I um, would not have understood that
Mm.
ahead of time.
Mm.
So it's really about a large contribution you see then is building individuals' capacities to
Mm-hmm.
interact successfully and
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
build new skills for problem solving. Oh, very interesting. And the next slide.
Yeah.
So this is an analysis of just different change strategies. I'm uh, this is the current iteration.
Okay.
I've felt a bit uncomfortable with some of this. It's been in development over a number of years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, I think that here you're obviously trying to work in the co-creating
Yeah.
change
Yeah.
strategy. Hmm?
Yeah.
Any
Yeah.
thoughts about this slide in terms of what it meant to you, or I don't know if you had time
I
to
didn't. I
look at it.
didn't look at it so much. I
Okay.
was waiting for you to guide me through.
Okay, so the
um,
supporting change strategy,
yeah.
there's a little bit of this in what you're doing because it's about creating um, people who are in positions of power supporting the change to
Yeah.
occur.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so just because of the convening you've had there,
Yeah.
it's partly what you've done as a strategy, the
Yeah.
upliftment. The forcing change strategy, I would say no.
No. No.
It's
No.
not
No.
about that.
Yeah.
The co-creating
Yeah.
change is where the
Definitely.
focus really is
Yeah.
about how can
Yeah.
we work together to do it differently.
Yeah.
The controlling change strategy is sort of using it in a more of a manipulative way to
Okay.
try to control the direction of change rather than really deal with
Yeah.
transformation,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, which is certainly not part of
Yeah.
your.
I would really say it was supporting and co-creating. Yeah.
So part of the goal of this slide, just for the background for you, is to try to build an understanding of the relationships between these different strategies,
Uh-huh.
suggesting that they are actually um, a comprehensive
Mm-hmm.
description of the strategies that are possible for change.
Mm-hmm.
And it grows a little bit out of Adam's emphasis upon we need power and love to
Yeah.
realize change,
Yeah.
and that we tend to focus as change agents upon the co-creating change,
Yeah.
because that's the nice thing. Um,
Right. That's the love energy. Yeah. And the
exactly.
supporting change is the love energy. Yeah.
And often it's blown out of the water by the forcing change strategies.
Yeah.
And that in times, I've gone through a number of cases. For instance, in South Africa, we needed forcing change, right? As a
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
part of the strategy to get to
Yeah.
the point of
Yeah.
co-creating change.
Right. 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 I'm just wondering if just looking at it, it looks like there's two positives and two negatives. I'm wondering if you can change some of the wording so that it doesn't sound so negative, because the forcing change could be something that's necessary, and doesn't necessarily have to be negative.
Mhm.
So it just, some of the wording of it sounds quite negative.
Is there
So
another word that would come to your mind that
yeah,
might?
I don't know. But I think maybe using some of this power language that Adam uses, which is, stepping into your own power, rather than, it's kind of like this empowering, like that you are forceful, you are powerful. So I don't know, it's maybe a bit more of that. Yeah.
Well, I'm also wondering about the words as from the position of the people who developed that strategy.
Yeah.
And I think from the position of the people that develop the strategy, often they would not see forcing change as negative.
Right. Right.
I was,
But you've just got, like, for example, the destructive power. So that's quite negative already. Like, it's got
oh,
a
oh,
balance, like
um,
it,
yeah, there's a whole another piece that goes with this. So
mm,
it's about, and it's framed around creative destruction.
okay. Okay.
And
Yeah.
so,
Just,
yeah,
just that word
oh,
there sounds like it's very negative.
okay,
If you
great. I
think,
never thought of it that way.
yeah,
Um, yes.
maybe the titles are fine, but it's just looking at some of the,
Well, the language,
yeah, yeah. I don't, yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know. I'm just
It
looking
really
at it
has to be
from,
seen with the
yeah,
rest of the
yeah,
piece that you're just making me think.
yeah, yeah.
Um, because it's posited by saying we've got to get beyond thinking of destruction as negative,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
remembering what Schumpeter said about creative destruction,
Hmm.
and that there's always destruction that's happening when there's creation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's and so we can get beyond that. Actually, I have a whole. This comes from a book I'm doing,
Okay.
and I have a whole. I have a couple of paragraphs about that very thing.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Okay.
but thank you for the one up. No one's talked to me about that before. Many thanks, Christel, for your time. Thanks so much for your participation, Jiran. We look forward to continuing this discussion with other topics.